In the winter of 1959, 9 young hikers vanished in the remote northern Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. Their expedition had been carefully planned, their route well documented, and their team highly experienced. There was nothing unusual about their journey until the moment it ended. Weeks later, search teams discovered their tent half buried in snow on a barren mountainside. The fabric had been cut open from the inside, as if the people inside had been desperate to escape immediately. Their boots and warm clothing were still neatly arranged inside the shelter, yet the hikers had fled barefoot into the freezing night. Their bodies were eventually discovered, scattered across the mountainside and deep in the forest below. Some had died from exposure to the brutal cold. Others had suffered injuries so severe that investigators compared them to the force of a high-speed collision. One woman was missing her tongue. Several victims had crushed rib cages without visible external wounds. There were no signs of a struggle, no tracks belonging to attackers, no evidence of an avalanche powerful enough to destroy the campsite. And the official Soviet conclusion would only deepen the mystery. According to investigators, the group had died because of an unknown compelling force. More than 60 years later, no one can say with certainty what that force was. The expedition was organized by students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, a respected technical university in the Soviet city of Sverdlovsk. Their leader, Igor Dyatlov, was only 23 years old, but already known among fellow climbers as disciplined, thoughtful, and technically brilliant. Friends described him as the kind of person who approached even small problems like an engineering puzzle, carefully analyzing every detail before making a decision. The team consisted of 8 men and 2 women, all experienced hikers accustomed to surviving extreme winter conditions. Many of them were engineering students, physicists, or recent graduates who viewed the expedition not only as adventure, but also as a test of endurance and teamwork. Their destination was Mount Otorten, a remote peak deep within the northern Ural range. The journey would qualify them for the highest category of Soviet winter trekking certification. Nothing about the plan seemed reckless, but the route required crossing a windswept mountain slope known locally as Kholat Syakhl. In the language of the indigenous Mansi people, the name means something unsettling. Mountain of the Dead. The expedition began on January 23, 1959. For several days, the journey progressed normally. The hikers traveled by train, truck, and finally skis as they moved deeper into the wilderness. They took photographs constantly, documenting the trip with the enthusiasm typical of young explorers. In these final images, the group appears relaxed and cheerful. They laugh while setting up camp, play in the snow, and cook simple meals in metal pots over portable stoves. One member of the expedition, Yuri Yuden, was forced to turn back early due to severe joint pain. As he said goodbye to the group, none of them had any reason to believe they would never meet again. Yudin would later become the only survivor connected to the expedition. For the remaining 9 hikers, the journey continued north toward the barren slopes of Kholat Syakhl. On the afternoon of February 1st, worsening weather conditions slowed the group's progress as they approached the mountain pass. Strong winds swept across the exposed slope, carrying thick clouds of snow that reduced visibility. Instead of descending into the nearby forest for shelter, Dyatlov made a decision that would later become one of the most debated aspects of the case. He ordered the group to set up camp directly on the mountainside. Researchers have proposed several explanations for this choice. Some believe Dyatlov wanted to practice camping in difficult conditions as part of their certification training. Others suggest deteriorating visibility made it too risky to navigate through the forest at night. Whatever the reason, the group carefully cut a flat platform into the snow and erected their tent against the slope. According to recovered diary entries, the evening passed normally. The hikers prepared dinner, discussed their plans for the next day, and settled in for the night. At some point after midnight, something happened inside that tent, and whatever it was, terrified them enough to flee into the darkness. Search teams eventually discovered the campsite on February 26th. The tent was partially collapsed under snow, but the scene inside told a disturbing story. Investigators found boots, coats, cameras, and food supplies still neatly arranged inside. It was clear that the hikers had not left the tent gradually or calmly. They had left in a hurry. Even more disturbing was the condition of the tent itself. several long slashes had been cut through the fabric from the inside. This meant the hikers had not used the entrance. Instead, they had cut their way out, as if escaping from something. Outside the tent, investigators discovered a trail of footprints leading down the mountainside. The tracks belonged to the hikers themselves. What made them strange was the way they appeared. The footprints were not chaotic. They did not suggest panic or running. Instead, they indicated that the group had walked calmly down the slope toward the forest, nearly a mile away. Some prints were barefoot. Others showed only socks, in temperatures approaching -30°C. Under normal circumstances, even a few minutes of exposure would be dangerous. The hikers had walked nearly 20 minutes in those conditions, which raises an unsettling question. What inside the tent could have been worse than freezing to death outside? The footprints eventually led to the edge of a small forest. There, investigators discovered the first two bodies beneath a large cedar tree. They belonged to Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonichenko. Both men were dressed only in underwear. Their skin showed signs of severe hypothermia. But there were other details that disturbed investigators. The branches of the cedar tree were broken nearly 5 meters above the ground, suggesting that one of the men had climbed it in desperation. Beneath the tree were the remains of a small fire. Nearby, pieces of bark had been stripped away, likely used as fuel. But the strangest detail was the condition of their hands. Their fingers were badly damaged, as if they had been clawing at the tree in panic, or trying to climb higher to escape something on the ground. 3 more bodies were discovered between the cedar tree and the abandoned tent. One of them was Igor Dyatlov. Nearby lay Zinaida Kolmogorova and Rustem Slobodin. Their positions suggested a tragic sequence of events. After reaching the forest, several members of the group had attempted to return to the tent, but they never made it. Slobodin had suffered a fractured skull, yet the injury was not immediately fatal, which meant he had continued walking after receiving it. Something had injured him before he died in the snow. For 2 months, 4 members of the expedition remained missing. They were finally discovered in May, after snow began melting. Their bodies were found in a ravine nearly 70 meters deeper into the forest. The scene was disturbing. Unlike the others, these victims were partially dressed in clothing taken from their dead companions, an indication that the group had tried to redistribute warm clothing in a desperate attempt to survive. But the injuries found on these bodies were unlike anything investigators expected. Lyudmila Dubinina had suffered massive chest trauma. Several ribs were broken inward with such force that doctors compared the injury to being struck by a vehicle. Another victim, Semyon Zolotaryov, showed similar crushing injuries, yet the skin on their bodies displayed almost no external damage, as if enormous pressure had been applied without leaving visible marks. And Dubinina's body revealed something even stranger. Her tongue was missing. So were parts of her lips and facial tissue. During the investigation, several items of clothing were tested for contamination. To the surprise of investigators, some showed elevated levels of radiation. The discovery was briefly mentioned in official reports, but never explained. During the late 1950s, the Soviet Union was conducting numerous secret military experiments, including nuclear weapons development and high-altitude rocket tests. Some researchers believe the hikers may have accidentally wandered into a classified testing zone. Others suggest the radiation was unrelated and came from previous laboratory works performed by one of the students. But in a case already filled with strange details, the radiation measurements only added to the mystery. Adding to the confusion were reports from nearby settlements describing mysterious glowing spheres in the sky during the same period. Several witnesses claimed they had seen bright orange lights moving silently above the mountains around the night of February 1st. Some investigators believe these may have been experimental rockets launched from military bases hundreds of kilometers away. Others argue that the lights could have been atmospheric phenomena or distant missile tests. But for many people fascinated by the case, the reports opened the door to far more exotic possibilities. Modern researchers have proposed that a rare type of avalanche may have triggered the initial panic inside the tent. Known as a slab avalanche, this phenomenon occurs when a dense layer of snow suddenly cracks and slides across a slope. If the hikers believed a larger avalanche was imminent, they may have cut their way out of the tent and moved downhill to escape the danger. This theory explains why they left the tent quickly, but it does not explain everything. The slope where the tent stood was relatively shallow. There were no large avalanche deposits found at the campsite. and it remains unclear how an avalanche could cause the extreme injuries seen in the ravine victims without leaving visible trauma. Another explanation focuses on the possibility of panic triggered by environmental factors. Extreme winds can sometimes produce a phenomenon known as infrasound, low-frequency vibrations that are not consciously heard, but can cause intense anxiety, disorientation, and feelings of dread. Some researchers speculate that unusual wind patterns on the mountain may have created such an effect, triggering irrational fear among the hikers. But even if panic played a role, it still does not explain the injuries, or the missing tongue, or the radiation. The most unsettling aspect of the Dyatlov Pass mystery is the combination of clues that refuse to align into a single explanation. The hikers were intelligent and experienced, yet they abandoned their only shelter in the middle of a lethal winter night. They walked calmly into the darkness. Some attempted to climb trees, others tried to return to the tent. Several suffered injuries that seemed almost impossible to explain, and all of it happened in one of the most isolated regions of the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. The Soviet investigation eventually closed the case with a vague and unsettling statement. According to official documents, the hikers died because of an unknown compelling force. The files were sealed for decades. No further explanation was provided. Even today, the Dyatlov Pass incident raises questions that remain difficult to answer. Why did the hikers cut open their tent instead of using the entrance? What caused the crushing injuries to several victims? Why were some items contaminated with radiation? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, what could frighten 9 experienced explorers enough to willingly step into a deadly snowstorm? The mountains of the northern Urals are vast, silent, and unforgiving. Wind erases tracks, snow buries evidence, and time slowly turns tragedies into legends. Somewhere on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl, the final moments of those 9 hikers unfolded in darkness, far from any witness who could explain what truly happened. Perhaps it was a rare natural disaster, perhaps it was an accident involving secret military technology, or perhaps the truth is something far simpler. A chain of small decisions and misfortunes that spiraled into catastrophe. But until every detail can be explained, the Dyatlov Pass incident will remain what it has been for more than half a century. A mystery frozen in snow, waiting for an answer that may never come. If you enjoy dark mysteries and forbidden history, subscribe to the Black Archive.